This particular event happened in, well, not in Seward, Alaska, but fairly close to Seward, Alaska on September 23rd, 2011. And again, in this particular case, because of the type of damage that occurred to the aircraft, the NTSB determination, it was a few weeks later where the determination by the NTSB to make it an accident occurred. So once again, there was no on-site visit for this either by the NTSB, FAA, or AMD. Well, the mission was a glacier study, and the damage was found to be substantial. Again, fortunately, there were no injuries. The call when needed contract was in place. And what I'd like to say in this particular event, even though it was unfortunate that it occurred in the first place, the procedures and policies followed by the Park Service folks were exactly the way that they should be, and kudos to them, and actually a good learning lesson for everybody. As I said, on September 23rd, about 11:15 in the afternoon, or I'm sorry, 11:15 in the morning, the vendor-owned Bell 206 sustained substantial damage while it was conducting a glacier study on the Harding ice field in Alaska. You can see Seward is located on the upper right portion of your screen. The Harding ice field sort of in the center of the general location of the Kenai Peninsula, south of Anchorage. This particular flight actually started back on August 22nd when a request from the Kenai Forge Park was submitted to AMD in Anchorage. And they needed a couple of days availability with the Long Ranger helicopter during the period of September 13th through the 30th. Well, the helicopter was sourced from an on-call contract, and the mission was to conduct a glacier study on the Harding ice field about 15 miles west-southwest of Seward, Alaska. Well, it looked like the weather was going to be very favorable for September the 23rd, so the Park Service employees updated their Project Aviation Safety Plan and the flight following form used by the Park Service in the Alaska Regional Emergency Communications Center at Denali. So on the 23rd of September at about 7 o'clock in the morning, the mishap pilot actually flew over from Homer and arrived at Seward and met with the Park Service employees and discussed the mission and conducted a brief. The pre-flight mission brief and the safety brief were conducted. They reviewed the load count. They had about an hour and a half fuel on board. The weather at Seward at the time was scattered clouds with 10 miles of visibility. Temperature was 42 degrees with a dew point temperature of 35 degrees. Now here's something that's very important. We're going to take a look at the weather at Seward. I've already told you the temperature and dew point. So you've got a pretty good spread, about 7 degrees between the two. And where the actual event occurred, there was a weather reporting station located fairly close, and it paints a completely different picture as far as the temperature and dew point. And so I'm sure most of you know that when you get the temperature and dew point fairly close to each other, within 3 to 4 degrees, you have a pretty good chance of fog developing in the area. Well, the Park Service, the folks stated that while they did not specifically discuss what to do if the weather deteriorated, it was mentioned that they did have some backup plans if the weather wasn't very cooperative. If it didn't look good in one direction toward a site, then they would go to another one. That was clear. If the weather didn't look good to go to the interstate, that they would just return to Seward, and if the weather didn't look good enough to go anywhere, they would just stay where they were until the conditions improved. About 9:15 that morning, they got the flight following established, and the aircraft departed Seward under VFR, or Visual Flight Rules, conditions. Mishap pilot was seated in the right front seat. One of the Park Service employees and the designated helicopter manager was sitting in the left front, and the other employee was seated in the right aft seat. Their first stop was at the Elk Bravo site. They departed Seward and landed over there. They touched down about 9:30, and 2 Park Service employees got out and started doing their field work. Everyone agreed that the winds at the site were about 20 miles an hour. Well, once the work was completed, they got back into the helicopter and departed about 11:10. Their next stop was heading for Glacier Charlie. About 10 miles north of where they were, you can see that the direction that they were traveling, the pilot mentioned that the clouds were about 1,000 feet above ground level. Visibility was greater than 10 miles underneath it. You can see some of the weather conditions starting to form. While he was on the ground there and they were conducting their mission, the Mr. Pilot did not update any weather or verify or check any other weather stations in the area prior to leaving the site. Well, a few minutes into the flight, the pilot encountered foggy conditions, and he was about 100 feet above the ground level. He still said the visibility was pretty good, greater than 3 miles underneath. Well, as the conditions began to worsen, the Park Service employees said that they and the pilot started discussing the weather and some of the possible options that they would have. Everyone stated that the flight conditions quickly deteriorated, resulting in reduced visibility. They said that from the time that the weather started to get bad, and from the time they landed was less than 1 minute. Well, in his effort to maintain visual contact with the ground, the mishap pilot said that he started to slow down and they began to descend to land. But with the limited visibility and flat-like conditions, the mishap pilot misjudged his altitude and inadvertently contacted the surface. Here is you can see on the picture, this is the location where the pilot touched down, the helicopter. Again, he was unaware that he had touched down or that he was going to touch down, but you can see in these particular pictures that the landing was not real soft. It was a pretty good jolt, and I'm sure that they were all surprised by hitting the ground.